Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. I'm Pari Sastry. I'm the newest member of the committee, along with Alyssa, who's here, Michael Barnett, Ishita, Diego. We are very excited to have today's webinar, which is part of the Young Scholar webinar series on climate change, macroeconomics, and finance, organized by the E-Axis Forum. We're proud to announce that today we are joined by our newly formed Young Scholars Subcommittee. These PhD candidates have been nominated by their supervisors as having a particularly keen interest in climate finance. They will be reading presented papers in advance, engaging in the Q&A as discussants, and working closely with the organizing committee for each webinar. Today I'm happy to introduce Olivier Darmouni, my colleague from Columbia Business School, who will present his research, which is co-authored with Yuki Zhang, called Brown Capital Reallocation. Olivier will examine whether reallocating brown capital across investors might lead to a limited reduction in aggregate carbon emissions. The concern is that climate-conscious investors might simply sell brown capital instead of scaling it down, i.e. choosing exit over voice. Olivier Darmouni is the Associate Professor of Finance at Columbia Business School and a financial economist whose research interests span corporate finance, financial intermediation, and the energy transition, his newest set of interests. He applies a variety of empirical methods and structural methods to understand how frictions affect firms' investments and credit markets more broadly. Prior to joining Columbia Business School, Olivier graduated with a PhD in economics from Princeton University. So, Olivier, I'll turn it over to you. And like we had discussed, maybe 45 minutes, and then we'll open the floor for our Q&A from the audience.
Yeah, thank you, Pari, for the introduction. It's great to be here. Thanks to the organizer. Thanks to everybody who's attending. I'm definitely looking forward to any thoughts and feedback. This is a topic that is definitely very important that I'm sure many of you have thought about, which is specifically the energy transition and the role that capital allocation plays into that, with the specific focus today on phasing out fossil fuel and in particular coal power production. So I think, needless to say, the green transition is likely to have a large impact on how the economy works. And by green transition, I just mean the large-scale transformation of many key sectors in an attempt to reduce carbon emission. And in particular, it's going to be important to both scale up green capital, but also to scale down brown capital that's very emission intensive. And in that respect, power production is, of course, an absolutely central sector. And we've seen the growth of alternatives to fossil fuels in recent years. And in particular, I think in any types of scenario that we think about going forward, closing coal power plant is an absolute priority, right? So just to make this very concrete, here would be one of the most prominent example of such scenario. That would be the net zero pathway of the International Energy Agency. And you already see in this graph immediately that in blue, the biggest sector that has to shrink the fastest is electricity and heat. In blue here, that's power production. And pretty much the first milestone that needs to be reached is phasing out coal in Western economies. Now, because of that, coal is often labeled as kind of enemy number one in Western economies because it's the single largest source of carbon emission globally. The UN even call phasing out coal as the single most important step in addressing climate change. And we've seen kind of a multiplication of commitments from government, new policy put in place to try to increase competition on renewable. On the financial sector side, we see the rise of so-called green finance, where financial institutions and investors are paying much more attention in the carbon content of their portfolio. And in that segment, coal has become a major red flag as well. So there's a declining trend in coal power production in the West, but there's still plenty of active coal power plants around. And so the question that this paper asks is, who owns this very brown capital? And so specifically, our study is going to focus on the ownership of firms that own coal power plants and see who are the investors of these firms. So there will be a direct link between real capital, the power plant, and financial capital, the investors. And the reason why we focus on who owns these plants or the equity investors in these brown assets is because they have the largest say in how plants are run and specifically whether they're going to be closed down. Because in the background, of course, there is a concern that yes, pressure might lead some climate conscious investor to try to reduce their emission, but they might stop at selling brown capital to other investors that are not quite as climate conscious. And so this is what we call in the corporate finance parlance, investor choosing to exit rather to exercise their voice. It leads to some worry that perhaps aggregate emission will not fall so much if it just means selling a brown asset to someone else. So specifically, here's an example of assets that are going to be in our data set, in our study. These are coal power plants. So they're not mine, even though sometimes they are close to mine, like this one. This is the Bełchatów plant in Poland. This is the single largest fossil fuel power plant in the Western world. It emits in a year as much carbon emission as a country like Switzerland. So in the paper, we're going to do three things. We're going to provide new data, new fact, and a new model to understand the underlying economic implications. So in the first part, we're going to build a bottom-up coal ownership data set that's going to combine two levels. On the real side, we're going to look at which firm owns individual coal power plant and how much they use these plants. And we're going to merge it with data on the financial side of who are the equity investors or the owners of these firms. Our main focus will be the EU and the UK, but if I have time, I'll touch a word about the US as well. Now, in the second part of the paper with this new data, we're going to document new facts about the dynamics of coal ownership in recent years. Specifically, we're going to look at the ownership changes across three investor groups: public equity investors who invest in firm in the stock market, private firm that invest in unlisted firms that are not in the stock market, and states and other forms of local government that are actually a pretty large player, pretty large owners of coal power plant. We'll do a formal decomposition that's going to distinguish between change of ownership coming from capital reallocation versus utilization. So in some sense, an investor, for example, can reduce how much coal it owns either by selling plants to other people or choosing exit. That would be capital reallocation. Or they could scale down plant faster than other investors. That would be capital utilization. We'll separate these and see how it looks in the data. So just to give you a bird's eye view of the main findings that I'll explain in more detail in just a few minutes, we do find a big increase in the ownership of coal by private firms that are not listed in the stock market over our period, a very large increase. And this increase is mirrored by a big decrease in the ownerships of public equity investors that are listed on the stock market. However, our decompositions show that this is not a very simple story of exit. In fact, this drop in ownership from the stock market is coming entirely from capital utilization, that investors of firms that are listed in the stock market are actually scaling down their plants or closing them faster than other investors. They are not selling to them. And in fact, we're going to uncover instead the key role of state investors. State investors have actually seemed to have slowed down the transition in two ways. They're actually very large, and they are the ones that have sold to private firms. And they also seem to be the ones that are the slowest at scaling down their plants. So that's going to lead us to want to understand better the underlying economic mechanism. And so for this, in the last part of the paper, we're going to develop a new model of brown capital reallocation. So at a high level, we'll have investors that are going to differ in how they value externalities, whether they're climate externalities or other source of externalities. There's going to be financial frictions that might impede trade of these brown assets across investors. And we'll think very seriously about the investment mandate of socially responsible investors. Do they take a micro perspective, just think about their own portfolio, or do they take more macro and impact perspective, thinking of how they're actually going to impact aggregate emission? And we'll calibrate the model to the macro data and we'll derive some implications. Here's a few highlights that I can already put forward. We actually find that state investors seems to highly value social factors like jobs or energy security, like stable energy supply, more than other investors seems to value them. That's actually going to be very important for the economics of the market in the sense that it's going to give state investors incentives to nationalize brown capital if other investors want to close them. And we will show that the existence of state investors can actually create a limit for the ability of green finance to actually reduce emission. And we'll talk about some specific episodes in Germany and Poland where this is happening as we speak. Okay, so a few words on the background. So our main focus is going to be on coal power plants in Europe. Why do we focus on Europe? Well, for three reasons. First, Europe is a large historical user of coal, but at the same time, it's the region that is at the forefront of the policy commitment of phasing out fossil fuel and coal more specifically, with a lot of very aggressive policy targets from the European Commission, for example, like Fit for 55 is the latest incarnation of that, with very aggressive plan for coal phase out. In the data, we do see that this is the region that experienced the largest decline in coal capacity since 2015 and the Paris Agreement, right? Just to be clear, the only region that have experienced a similar decline in coal power production has been North America. Everywhere else in the world since then, coal power production has been increasing. Now, what makes Europe particularly interesting for our study is the variety of firm ownership that we observe there. There's actually a very good mix of power plants that are owned by public listed firm listed on the stock market, but also private investors not listed on the stock market, as well as a big significant fraction of state ownership by state and local government. That contrasts with China, where almost all the ownerships of energy assets are done through state-owned enterprises, and also with the US, where almost all of it is owned by publicly listed firms. So here we'll be able to see in Europe exactly how the market dynamics and the trading potentially happen across this diverse group of investors that are potentially very different. So just a word on the data, which, by the way, we've made available some aggregate version on our website. You can look, for example, at my webpage if you want to download some data on European ownership of coal power plant. We're going to merge two sources of data. So there's the data from Real Capital, which is about the physical asset, the coal power plant, which firms own coal power plant. And so for this, we're going to use data from the universe on coal power plants in the EU and the UK from an NGO called Beyond Fossil Fuel from 2015 to 2022. We have a lot of really good information about the specific plants. We can see the exact location, their maximum generation capacity, but also crucially the name of the firm that owns that plant. We also have a really good measure of scale, how much that plant is actually used, because we can observe annual plant level carbon emission from the European carbon market, right? So these are not voluntary disclosure. These are part of the carbon market requirements. Then we're going to merge this with data on financial capital, which is which investor own these firms in turn. For publicly traded firm, we can go to Capital IQ. For other firms, we're going to do some manual collection. Okay, and most of the results I'm going to show you in the first part of the paper, we're going to decompose investors into three main groups: public equity investors, so that's the stock market; private equity, this is other types of private sector investment, not through the stock market; and then state investors. Just to make sure we're on the same page, we can break down the source of carbon emission from coal power plants specifically in our microdata. So on the left, just to make sure we understand across country, you can see this is for 2021, that Germany and Poland, together are about 2/3 of all the coal power emission in Europe. Okay, so they're going to be very important. We'll talk specifically about Germany and Poland when it's relevant. But importantly for us, we can also break it down by firm. Which firms own the most carbon from coal in Europe? And you can see the big three here, and it's actually no coincidence where they are located. PGE is a Polish firm, RWE or RWE is German, and EPH is Czech, and Czech is the third largest country. So these big three firms own about a third, more than a third of the coal carbon emission in Europe. What's particularly interesting for us, and this is a motivating example for the rest of what I'm going to show you today, is who actually owns these firms. Well, PGE is Polish, it's listed on the stock market, but the state in orange here actually owns over 60% of the shares. That contrasts with RWE, which is German, also listed on the stock market, but there the state only owns about 10% of the shares. The rest is other private sector investors. And then EPH, the third largest, is actually 100% private. It's almost entirely owned by a single individual, which is a Czech businessman, billionaire, Daniel Krasinski, who actually just bought ThyssenKrupp, I think yesterday in Germany, along many other firms. So what we're going to be interested in is how these very different investors, public equity, private equity, and state interact. So let me start by an aggregate picture of the dynamics of coal ownership in Europe since 2015. So there's some very clear facts that emerge. The first one is that we see a large rise in private ownership. This you can see in the grid line on this graph here, where at the beginning of our sample, private firms own about 10% of emission, but by the end of our sample, they own over 20% of emission from coal at this point in time. So that's a 12 percentage point increase, more than doubling their initial share. At the same time, we see a very big decline from the ownership from the stock market investors, that's in blue, or public equity, that has dropped by 9 percentage point, from around 45% to around 36% during our time. And then state ownership in red has been fairly stable over time. It's declined a little bit, but here I just want to emphasize how big state investors are. So you see in red throughout our sample, they're going to be always between 40 and 45% of carbon emission from coal. So this aggregate picture doesn't really tell you what's going on. So to uncover the dynamics, we're going to introduce a formal reallocation to understand what's happening. Okay, the aggregate is going to mask some striking pattern. So remember, the concern here is that some investor might become more climate conscious, but they might stop at only selling brown capital to other less conscious investor, climate conscious investor, rather than scaling it down. And I would be choosing exit over voice, and that might not change very many things in the aggregate or the macro level if everybody's just choosing exit. So specifically, we're going to decompose the ownership change I showed you on the previous graph by how much they come from trading with other investors versus scaling down. And so the first part we'll call capital reallocation term, and the other will be capital utilization. They will be in blue and in red in the graph I'll show you in a second. So formally, you can define the ownership share of any investor group at any point in time as the product of how much little e over big E, which is how much a plant, what's the amount of emission from a specific plant over total emission, times omega G, which is how much this investor group own that particular plant, okay? The ownership share. And the ownership share of an investor group can change either because omega changes, they're selling some of their plants, or because the emission of that plants are changing. They're scaling it down or closing it. So mathematically, you can show that any change in ownership share, like I showed you a couple of slides ago in aggregate, can be decomposed in 3 terms exactly. A blue term of capital allocation that tells you in English, if I had to keep plant scale constant, how much would the ownership share of an investor group has fallen just because they've been trading with others, just because of reallocation. Then how much, in contrast, comes from a capital utilization term that's going to be in red, which is the opposite. What if I kept ownership constant? We're not allowed to trade. How much would ownership have changed if I just look at decreasing plant scale over our sample period? And then finally, there's a green term just to make this exact, a covariance term, which is exactly when both happens at the same time, changing ownership exactly when plants change scale. And this typically is going to be small in the data. Okay. So let's apply the decomposition to our 3 main investor group, and that's going to paint a very interesting
question.
Please.
On the previous slide, do you know what the precise mechanisms are for how capital utilization is being affected? So are they investing in lower emission technologies, or are they actually closing down these coal plants? Do you know what they've actually done to achieve sort of a positive term for, or negative, depending on how you define it, for the middle term?
Yeah, so it's mostly a combination of permanent closure, so retiring capacity, and just producing less output for a given capacity, so kind of soft closure in some sense. There's not a lot of, there's, as much as we know, very little investment in technology here. And certainly nothing like carbon closure either. This is just not happening.
Thank you.
So it's mostly just turning it down either permanently or temporarily. Great. So let me go through the first graph on the left slowly, because this is important, and we're going to see multiple graphs like that to make sure we know how to interpret it. So what happens when we apply the decomposition to public equity investors here on the left? Well, remember first that in the aggregate, we saw that public equity ownership has fallen by 9 percentage points in aggregate over a sample period. So that means that by 2022, the sum of the red line, the blue line, and the green line has to be equal to minus 9 percentage points, 9%. And here it's going to tell you where's this 9% coming from. And is it coming from just exit from the fact that public equity investors have sold their coal power plants to other? And the answer is largely no, because that would come from a very negative blue line of capital reallocation, and this is not what we see. Instead, except in the very last year, which I will come to, there's something very striking that happened in 2022 specifically, but overall, we don't see a large negative capital reallocation term at all. Instead, we see a very large capital utilization term in red here that explain basically the entirety of the decline of public equity ownership, which means that largely stock market investors have not sold their power plant to other investors. Instead, they have scaled down faster than others. So there's no evidence, no clear evidence for exit to explain this change in ownership. But then, we see that in the middle panel that private equity ownership has risen a lot. So isn't that coming from them buying assets from others? And the answer is yes, because for private investors, we see a very large blue capital reallocation line. That means that the increase of private equity ownership that we saw that is strikingly large is coming from buying coal from other investors. But if they're not buying from public equity investors, who are buying from? Well, they're buying from the state. And you can see that very clearly in the last panel on the right. So you see the state has a very negative blue capital reallocation term, which means they've been selling lots of brown assets during our sample period, and to private equity in particular. Now, if you remember, in aggregate, the state ownership share was fairly stable. Well, the decomposition is very helpful to see that's the product of two very large forces going in opposite direction. On the one hand, we just talked about it, there's the negative blue capital reallocation line. They've been selling lots of brown assets. This is pushing down the ownership of the states. But at the same time, there's a very positive red line of capital utilization. So what does that mean? It means that the states are also the slowest at scaling down the plants that they own compared to other investors. And that's going to push their ownership share up. Okay. So if you wanted to have a negative interpretation of this purely statistical decomposition of the aggregate fact on the right, you could say that state investors seem to have slowed down the transition in two ways. Once by selling directly to private equity, and two by being the slowest at scaling down plants that they haven't sold. Now, because states are so important, as we just discovered, I want to spend a little more time to understand exactly what drives their behavior. So the first thing I want to do is to show you a stark contrast between the behavior of domestic state investors and foreign state investors. So Europe, being actually a fairly well-integrated market, has perhaps a surprisingly large amount of foreign state ownership. So for example, the red line shows you that at the beginning of our sample, foreign states, which mean they're states, but they're not the one where the actual plant is located, own as much as 15% of the entire emissions of the coal power production sector in 2015. But even more striking is the big divergence between domestic and foreign state, right? Foreign state have actually seen their ownership share dramatically collapse. It's been cut in three, from about 15 to as low as 5% by the end of our sample. While domestic state have seen instead a very large increase from just over 30% to almost 40% by the end of our sample. Okay. Now, we can apply our decomposition separately for domestic and foreign state just to understand a little better what's happening. On the left, we already saw that picture that if you put all states invested together, we see two things happening at the same time. We see a very negative capital reallocation when they're selling brown capital to other investors. And the decomposition here shows on the right that this is all coming from foreign state investors. They are the one who did the lion's share of the selling. And we'll talk again about that in a second. We also saw that in aggregate, there's a big increase in capital reallocation. That's the big positive red line for state investors. That means they're slow at scaling down the plant, but this is all coming from domestic state investors. Okay, so we see kind of diverging pattern here that are masked in the aggregate. So to really understand the underlying economics, I actually want to talk about a few specific episodes, right? States are so large that they've been involved in actually some of the most important transactions in the market for brown capital, and specifically coal power plant, that I want to talk about these in a little bit more detail. So each of them on its own is kind of an anecdote, but I think together they actually paint a fairly coherent picture of what's the underlying economic forces. That's why I want to spend about a minute or two max on each, a minute on each. So The first of the five is talking about the E.ON Uniper asset split of 2015. And some of you, I'm sure, might be familiar with that. So E.ON is a German utility giant that decided that they want to carve out all of their fossil fuel operation in a new company. So E.ON was listed on the stock market, thought it would be a good idea to separate. So they created a new firm also listed on the stock market called Uniper. And particular important question for us is, who became the investor in Uniper? Is it the same investors that previously owned E.ON, or did they change? And the question is, who actually bought Uniper once it was formed? And the answer is basically Finland. So Finland, via the state-controlled Fortum utility, gained control of Uniper soon after the carve-out, and they owned as much as 75% by the time the deal went through, suggesting that perhaps traditional stock market investors are not so willing to invest in fossil fuel company, but that state kind of perhaps are exposed to less direct pressure, maybe paradoxically. Now, the second thing I want to talk about is we talked about how foreign states sold massively to private equity, explaining a big part of the rise in private ownership of coal. Well, by far the most striking example of that was Vattenfall selling its German coal business. So Vattenfall is a Swedish utility that's owned by the Swedish state that owns a surprisingly large amount of coal power plant in Germany. In 2016, they decided to sell them to EPH, the Czech private firm that I mentioned at the beginning. What was the reason that Vattenfall expressed for doing that? Well, they wanted to green their corporate balance sheet by reducing their CO2 profile. Well, you can imagine what kind of backlash they faced when they meant that. Here's a quote from that article talking about the reaction, saying, ask whether greening Vattenfall's CO2 balance sheet would have any positive impact on the climate if it was achieved by simply selling their plant to another corporation. The CEO at the time said that the operation of coal power plant was a matter of political policy and not within the company's bailiwick. So you can see it's very striking behavior that where these foreign states seems to take kind of a very micro perspective, right? They really think about the ownership of the asset, the carbon intensity of the asset that they own, rather than thinking the macro impact of their portfolio decision. And you can see for states how it's tempted to do that, where they want to think mostly through their own jurisdiction and maybe take more of a micro approach. This kind of contrast between climate-conscious investor taking a micro versus a macro approach is going to be very important for the underlying economics. And I'll touch about this again briefly in the model when I get there. Now, the third thing I want to talk about is the energy crisis that started in 2021 and got completely out of hand in Europe in 2022 with the beginning of the Russian-Ukrainian conflict and the very sharp decline in import of Russian gas. I'm sure many of you are aware, coal power plant has been turned on back to unprecedented, to historical level in 2022 and 2021 to try to face shortage of energy from other sources. And so we can see that in the data. In the top plot, we see a rebound in the total aggregate amount of emission from coal. They've been declining for years, and they started to increase again because plants were turned on. And then if you look in our data, we can use our decomposition to ask which investors actually turned on increased utilization the most during this period. And the answer is state investors, domestic state investors specifically, which kind of seems to match the intuition that perhaps states care relatively more about energy security than other types of investors, and seems to be something that is very high on their list of priority during this time. Now, linked to that, I want to talk about, very importantly, two important episodes of nationalization that happened in coal power plant sector. So first in Germany and then in Poland. So I'm sure some of you are aware of that. Uniper, the company that we talked about earlier that was carved down from E.ON, went bankrupt in 2022. And no one wanted to pick it up. And the federal government of Germany didn't want it to go down, and so first orchestrated the largest corporate bailout in German history, and eventually spent as much as 8 billion euros of taxpayer money to actually buy back the company and fully nationalize it. And again, the motive here was just energy security. They just couldn't afford to let this fossil fuel plant go down during this time. That's what was the stated motivation. Now, not exactly the same, but related, Poland has also witnessed a massive change in nationalization. In 2023, the government announced that they will buy all the coal power plants owned by the big publicly listed firm in Poland, spending as much as €4 billion of taxpayer money on buying these very brown assets. Okay, and again, the story here is very clear. The companies are complaining that they are facing market pressure because they own these plants and they can't borrow, they can't invest. So they want to sell. And the government, on the other hand, doesn't want the plants to go down because of energy security. Poland is by far the most coal-reliant country in Europe and one of the most important in the world in terms of how the energy production sector is relying on coal. And so they didn't want to close them. And now these assets used to be owned by publicly traded firm on the stock market are now going to be owned by the government of Poland. So I think that really shows how incentives to nationalize are just a limiting factor that we're going to have to embrace very seriously. Now, last point, every setting is of course different, but I just want to say that globally, it's very clear that the state ownership of coal asset is increasing, if only because China has seen a dramatic rise in coal power production over recent years, and that all investments are done through state-owned enterprises. Okay, so of course, every setting is different, but I think some of the facts that we're documenting in Europe, I think, are useful and can have important lessons more generally. So here, I just want to pause for a second because we talked a lot about state investor in coal and the kind of crucial role that they played in recent years. Isn't there a feeling of a paradox of state ownership? Because typically we tend to, when we're economists, we tend to think about states as being at the forefront of commitments to reduce emission. And, the private sectors are, quote unquote, the bad guys, right? The states are here to implement new regulation, new taxes, new subsidies, to try to develop alternative to fossil fuel and things like that. Yet in the data, states are a large owner of brown capital and in fact, with a rising ownership share. And so I think the evidence that I showed you suggests that states likely do care about climate externalities, but that there's two limiting factors. First, seems to be often trading them off against local social factors like jobs, or more recently, stable energy price, or what we call energy security, that perhaps are not being internalized as much by other investors that perhaps are entirely focused on emission or much more focused on emission than these other factors that the state might care about. Now, note, we're not saying the states are benevolent social planner. They might be doing greenwashing. They might be captures from some of the industry. They might be free riding on global emission reduction and so on. We just want to make clear that this is a factor that seems to be important to how state investors behave. And second limiting factor is that state seems that they often have a narrow mandate, at least in how they act, maybe in spite of what they say. That's in line with some of the recent theory of socially responsible investor, that they kind of take more of a micro perspective that kind of spans just their jurisdiction, and they might be quick to sell coal assets if they're broad, like we see in the case of Vattenfall. Okay, an alternative version of that is that they might be trying to invest or preserve position in coal asset elsewhere that are not as visible. Also importantly, I think for the underlying economics, states are likely less subject to financial pressure than private investors, than other investors. They have deeper pockets because they can tax and borrow on their own. And they also perhaps less exposed to the risk of tighter future regulation or taxes because they have a bigger seat at the table when it comes to making the law. So I think that this combination makes them stand out and means that state investors that have incentives to nationalize might represent a natural limit for how much green finance can actually reduce aggregate emission. Okay, so in the last part of the paper, we developed a new model of brown capital reallocation to understand the underlying economics and draw some implications. So in the time that I have today, I want to keep time for questions. So I'm not going to go through the detail of the model. I'm just going to highlight the key ingredients and just draw some implications. Okay, so capital reallocation has been studied before by economists, but here we want to add one crucial layer, that is the production externality that comes with brown capital. Okay, so Specifically, we want to understand what are the forces that makes an owner want to keep any unit of brown capital that they initially own. Do they want to keep them on? Do they want to turn them off? Or do they want to sell them to private firms? Importantly, we're going to have investors that vary in how they value climate externalities. So there's going to be a parameter epsilon. For example, private firm who say they care the least, epsilon is 0, but public firm, they might care to some amount, representing the fact that stakeholder pressure might work, in addition to any sort of pecuniarity effect of carbon taxes and other sorts of compulsory regulation that they're facing. Okay. Not all plants will be equally profitable, of course, in part because of these regulation. There's financial friction, though, that can impede the trading of brown capital. So if you want to sell, you're not going to be able to get the full price because other people who want to buy, they can only borrow at kind of an expensive rate. And then finally, we'll think hard about this micro versus macro perspective that climate conscious investor might take. So there would be a parameter theta that tells you how much you actually internalize the effect on the aggregate of your portfolio allocation. If theta is 0, when you sell, it's as if emission has gone to 0 as much as you're concerned. But if your theta is close to 1, you actually internalize that and you realize that selling doesn't solve the problem. Okay. And that's going to be very important for the dynamics. Okay. So let me just skip some of the detail in the interest of time. I just want to highlight that in equilibrium, we'll find that the plants are going to be kept on, some plants are going to be sold, and some plants are going to be turned off, like we see in the data. But importantly, the only thing in the model that makes you want to turn off a plant is because of your mandate being macro enough that you actually internalize externalities. If you put this mandate parameter theta to 0, which means I take only a micro perspective, units are never turned off in equilibrium. People would rather sell them for a penny and make a penny rather than close them because they don't internalize the effect on the climate. So that's going to be very important for us. The other thing I just want to highlight is the impact of the financial sector of green finance. Financial frictions, if bankers, for example, are very reluctant to finance the purchase of coal power plants by firms, that is going to have an effect on equilibrium. It's gonna make it less attractive to sell because it's harder to find a buyer for a good price, and it's going to lead to more unit being turned off. So that's what you would see in this graph. When there's no financial friction, there's less units that are being turned off. And so I just want to say that in general, we think financial frictions are bad for the economy. That's the traditional view. They lead to misallocation. But here it's kind of the opposite. In the presence of externalities, green finance can actually help to correct some of these externalities. It's kind of what in economics we often call the theory of the second best. And I think that's important to understand that this is a key channel by how financial green finance can help. However, there's a very clear limit. It's the existence of state investors that might have incentive to nationalize. So let me just skip to this slide. I'll skip the calibration. The problem is that green finance, the rise of green finance can actually increase incentives for the government to nationalize unit. That happens if the government cares about things like social factors that maybe climate conscious investors don't value as much. So there's been a big debate about in ESG, whether E is taking all of the attention and no one is paying enough attention to the other components. That's one story you could tell, that some states care a lot about social factors like jobs and energy security, and that perhaps some of the push from environmental pressure is not correctly accounting for that, potentially according to some states. When that happens, this misalignment is what creates the incentives to actually create nationalization. And that's exactly what we saw in Poland. In fact, the stronger the green pressure, the green finance movement, the stronger the incentive to nationalize. Okay, and so that's one of the key punchline I think that comes out of our paper is state investors represent a limit for the ability of green finance to reduce emissions. So we can't just ignore the existence of state ownership. Okay. And I'll just wrap up by saying, how do you want to go around that and try to reduce the incentive for state investors to intervene? Well, you need to make sure you develop alternatives locally that can create other jobs, that can create alternative supply of energy, so like renewable, but they have to be local. Otherwise, the states doesn't internalize them as much. And so to me, it's not obvious in the data whether any money that's leaving the fossil fuel sector, for example, in Poland, is actually going to fund alternative in places like Poland to try to undo the incentive of the Polish state. So there's a big open question, something I'm personally very interested about, which is kind of the global allocation of capital between green and brown, and whether we can make sure states don't get in the way. Okay, like we saw in the recent COP28, where states are clearly getting in, some subset of states are really getting in the way because they are only bearing costs and they are not necessarily seeing some of the upside. Okay, I'll wrap up here. I just want to say we document some important change in the ownership of brown asset with a decline in stock market ownership and a rise in private ownership, but that should not obscure the rise of state ownership. And I hope that this was thought-provoking to think about states not just as benevolent planners that fix taxes and regulation, but also as investors that might be facing trade-off and have a very important impact on the path of the transition. I think there's many open questions that many people here in the room, I'm sure, are also thinking about, and I look forward to think more with you going forward. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak, and I welcome any questions you may have.
Amazing. Thank you, Olivier. That was very interesting and instructive. I'll start us off with a question and then or two, and we can see if people have any questions in the chat or on video. So I'll just start off by wondering how you're thinking about welfare here. I mean, in some sense, the fact that the states are choosing to keep these coal plants open, like you said, is an optimal decision that they're making because they have these other social factors that the private sector isn't thinking about. So climate is one externality, but maybe these social factors like independent energy production is another. And so how are you thinking about this in the context of welfare?
Yeah, I think that's the biggest question that this raises. And I would say this is the second bullet point I highlighted here, which is I think they've been an amazing work that took decades to try to quantify the social cost of carbon emission. And I think that's been immensely useful to show how what's the value of reducing carbon and how much we should spend on it. I think there's much less serious academic work on quantifying the potential social cost of the transition, which is interesting because that's a lot what the politicians talk about and how the law is actually being made. That's a lot what some voters think about. That's a lot what some media talk about, but there's much less academic research on quantifying these. There's more and more paper talking about the impoverishment of local communities where that used to rely on fossil fuel and things like that. There's a lot of politics literature on diplomacy and international relation, but I think much less kind of the more traditional welfare quantification from microeconomists on how should we trade off these two. I think there's also, I would say, sometimes people told me the analogy of desindustrialization, that we moved a lot of manufacturing job abroad in the West, and maybe we didn't anticipate some of the social costs, which I don't know if that's true, but there's kind of an interesting analogy there that I think to understand, especially the behavior of the state, we want to be able to quantify these costs and be able to tell, ask ourselves, are states are just greenwashing? Are they just being regulatory capture like some of the private sector agents might have been, and this has received lots of attention? Or are they actually doing something that might not be so bad for welfare? Or maybe it's only good for welfare locally and not globally. It's perhaps the biggest open question that is there. And I totally agree that we currently don't have a great answer to that.
Awesome. Great. So there are two questions in the Q&A. I don't know if you see them, Olivier, but I'll just read them out for you. So the first is from, and Alyssa also has a question. So maybe Alyssa, why don't you go first, and then we can do the two Q&A questions.
Sure. Yeah. So I guess I mostly just had a small reaction. So actually, indeed, you're absolutely right that as a state, you cannot just only think about the climate externality without thinking about the social dimension. And so I just wanted to refer to actually the work that we did, but then also in relation to some of the developments in the world. So in the paper, The Great Carbon Arbitrage, we look at the net benefits of phasing out coal and replacing it with renewables. And we find that actually there's a big net gain also at the country level from a social perspective. And indeed, for that reason, we argue that as a state, you have to, there's an economic case, a cogent sort of argument to pay grants for early closure of coal-fired power plants rather than selling it off, actually just paying for closure. And then also providing subsidies or other blended finance incentives to crowding capital markets to replace coal with renewables, so that you indeed do the phase out simultaneously with the phase in locally, as you say, Olivier. And actually, there are initiatives, actually in Germany before the the Ukraine war, the German government had in place something like that, where they provided subsidies via an auction where coal companies could voluntarily partake to close their operations early, and they had subsidies for renewables, and the German government referred to that as a social equilibrium. But then, after, with the Ukraine war, they kind of reversed their policy. That's in the West, but actually in the emerging and developing market economies, there are now a few climate finance deals that are referred to as just energy transition partnership deals. These have been struck with Indonesia, with South Africa, and with Vietnam. And in this case, Western governments have offered finance for renewables conditional on the commitment of these countries to retire coal capacity early. And it's meant, and so the money for renewables is blended, often supported also with funds from the Glasgow Alliance of Net Zero. But then there's also, at least in theory, this still needs to be implemented, but grant money provided to close the coal mines, so to essentially pay the owners for their stranded asset value, but also pay for the social transition that is compensating workers temporarily for their loss of job and helping them retrain specifically for jobs in the renewable industry, which is the growing industry, but also potentially jobs elsewhere. So I would say that there are, initiatives in the world, but also some academic work that exactly looks at that pairing, right? Because as you say, you cannot just close coal without having something in its place, which is one of the reasons why I think states have been this limiting factor, as you say, to the effectiveness of the capital markets to reduce brown. So it's more of a comment, but I thought it would be useful in the context of the discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. So we talk a lot about the German case. And as you said, the German case is emblematic about why this bundling is a lot of cheap talk, right?
Yeah.
German was supposedly very aggressive prior. And so as you mentioned, I'm not going to go into detail. You know a lot more. I'm sure many people in the audience do, but if you don't, this auction characterized by two key things, end up being massively undersubscribed. People didn't actually believe the ban was going to happen even before Ukraine. That's very important to know. And then after the Ukraine conflict, the government asked companies like Uniper that had previously got money to close early to reopen without transferring the money back. So I think, this kind of plan it's not done properly, and there's no clear assessment of what's the right trade-off. And we see that expose the incentives to reverse are so strong. And second, Poland has never done anything like that, but that's exactly how they sold the recent nationalization. The fossil fuel company said, we always wanted to invest in renewable, but we couldn't because the market doesn't let us borrow and invest because we have this brown asset. And the state says, we want to finance it and the transition, so let us buy the plant, and now we'll be able to get a just transition. We will see what happens, okay? They've got a new government, but I'm still not convinced that this is happening. So I agree, exactly. There's a lot of talk about pairing things, and that's all good and well, but we still have a big place to go to know how much we should impose decarbonization and social cost potentially, because it's going to be hard to just leave it in the hand of the states, especially experts. But I totally agree with you. This is amazing. I see there's a couple more questions in the chat, in the panelist. I'm happy to take these first.
Yeah, maybe let's group questions, Olivier, since we only have 10 minutes.
Yes.
So we have 6 in the Q&A and then 2 on video. So maybe let's do the Q&A because they've been waiting for a while, and then we can get to Yasmin and Abel.
Okay, so I see in the Q&A, I see Gabriela, thank you. Do you have any real data on firms and their ownership patterns? Yes, I mean, that's the entire thing we do. You can find on my website, for example, some aggregate data if you want to play with it. That is easy to merge with data from the NGO Beyond Fossil Fuel and with Capital IQ if you have access to that as well. Gregor, can you say more about the types and even individual private investors are filling the gap? Yes, we can do more than that. EPH is about half. So that's the company that is owned by this single Czech billionaire, Daniel Kratinsky, that also owns Soccer Team and French newspaper, and now the big German steel producer. It's about half. We have the rest in our data. You can look at it in the list of some firms. We can talk more about it. There's a lot of smaller players as well, but EPH is perhaps half and has been growing a lot. Teresa in the Q&A. Combining this result with the recent paper of Pari about the Net Zero Alliance, I wonder if you can really derive any conclusion about responsible investors. Well, we don't know. I mean, that's what we're trying to figure out. The responsible investor, how do they matter? How much good do they make? What are some of the limits that they face in terms of having incentive to greenwash, or maybe they don't greenwash, they want to do the right thing, but there's other factor that limits it. That is exactly what I think we should think about as a finance and macro researchers. You think about the underlying economics for them, capital allocation in, I do mostly energy transition, but you can think about other things like EV or whatnot, to actually see what the role of the financial system and economic system in general to giving the right incentive to achieve the right outcome. And we just don't know yet exactly how well it's playing out. There's been lots of progress in terms of absolute numbers, but more can probably be made. And we're trying to understand what's the impact of responsible investors. There's a lot of variety of them, though. So in different settings, it can play out very differently. I think that's important to embrace that, not make sweeping generality. Guillaume, that's my twin brother in the chat, who has worked a lot in energy himself before. I think beyond coal power plant, we'd love to do a study on gas plant because gas has been booming, especially in the US. So we'd love to understand who owns gas plant, who's financing these greenfield brown asset, even in Western world. And then, of course, incinerators, that you work for Veolia, love to write a paper on who owns incinerators and how they've been changing hands overall. But these markets, these assets are super illiquid, of course, super big. And so it's difficult to get great data, but it's that thing. These are some of the key things that come to mind. I'll take Paloma and Teresa quickly, and then we can take the two in that are in the panel. Do you observe change in utilization at the plant level? Yes. We can do that. That is the red line, the green line in covariance. So that's exactly what it is. You can look back at it. That is the covariance term exactly. Scaling down after change of ownership. And you'll see that is not so large. But in some cases, it's positive in the way you expect. People who buy plant tend to scale them up a little bit after. There is a lot of heterogeneity between the plant and state that might be more inclined to take over those hard to scale down enterprises. So it's possible. We don't have a great measure of heterogeneity. We have age, we have country, we can check that and see that there's some, this is not the only factor, but clearly in the model, we account for the fact that some plants are kind of more attractive to scale down than others for ex ante reason. And of course, that creates some sort of variation. We could delve more into that. It's a good question. Let me take, I think, yes, go ahead.
So Yasmin was first, so let's start with her. And then Abel had a question, but I don't know if Abel, you still want to. And then it's Sevgi. Yep. So go ahead, Yasmin.
I think, yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for an interesting presentation. I have actually two questions. So I was first wondering how your paper relates to the work of Alexander Andonov and Josh Rauch, which look at the declining public holdings of the electricity power plants in the US. And one thing that I was actually thinking is that you're kind of more after, well, obviously you focus on coal rather than electricity power plants. But I think also your paper dives quite a bit more into the mechanism behind why this is actually occurring. And related to that, I was wondering whether you know a recent paper from Tobias Berg. It has a very catchy title, Out of Sight, Out of Mind. And it actually looks at the selling of brown assets to private firms as a result of which emissions in a sense go dark. So I was wondering whether in the period prior to the Ukraine war, that could perhaps be an incentive for states to to sell off their holdings in the power plants. And regarding the theoretical framework, I was actually wondering whether you both need the difference in the valuation of externalities of investors and the SRI mandates, because I could imagine that the two of them are correlated or not independent of each other. And hence I was wondering or whether you need both of them in a model or whether the role of them could be captured in one parameter.
Yeah, this is a great question. Let me answer very briefly. So the first paper you mentioned, indeed, it's related, but then they do the whole electricity. And so they show there's a big composition that stock market firms don't do renewable. It's all private. So in aggregate, if you do both fossil fuel and renewable, the ownership share of domestic firm is going down. We do within fossil fuel, specifically within coal, and we look at trading within there, which, doesn't happen as much in the US. We have this in the paper as well. I think there's some notable reason compared to Europe for why that's the case. So I think we explored that a little bit. The paper by Tobias, I actually don't know. I know Tobias works very well, his prior type of work, and so I'll look at it. That seems great. I do think coal is a bit specific because I think it's really the eye of the storm. So it's hard to go dark with coal, right? We saw what happened when Vattenfall was selling. There was lots of coverage, negative coverage in Sweden and across Europe for doing that. So I think that's also maybe why stock investors are more aggressively scaling down rather than selling compared to many other settings that are not coal power plant, because the attention has been so much there. And then in the model, I'm happy to talk more about this offline. You can have very large valuation of externalities, so very large epsilon. If theta is close to zero, no aggregate emissions are going to change. So I think it's important to think about them separately as green finance, not just being concerned about emissions, but whether you internalize them or not. And if you don't, it's just totally different equilibrium and outcome. So we want to emphasize that along with other recent paper. Sergey.
Thank you so much.
Hello, thank you for this interesting presentation. I enjoyed reading your paper. And I have one question related to this paradox of the state. So do you think states are acquiring more ownership in coal power plants, not only due to social factors, but also because it makes emissions control easier for them in case there are more regulations in the future?
It's possible. I mean, it's possible. My reading, like for example, yes, but not in a good way. So for example, in post-Ukraine, the state-owned firm were the one that increased, utilization the most. So I don't know if that's a good thing, but for sure they are more able to control their emission. In the data, we don't see that at all across any countries that we can look at in Europe, that firm with a lot of state ownership actually reduced more after the Paris Agreement. So it's, to me, this positive spin is a little bit harder to rationalize compared to social factor, but it's not off the table. But both in terms of what states say and when state firm, how they behave over time seems to suggest that the social factor seems to us like the first order thing, but we don't want to say it's the only thing either. But yeah, for example, Poland, when they're going to own all of the plants, who knows how fast they're going to scale down. Now there's a clear mechanism by how they can scale down because these firms are listed in the stock market. There's a lot of places for activists to have their voice heard. Once it's all in the hand of the state, we don't know. And maybe Poland is going to scale them down like they promised. We'll see. I hope so. We'll see.
Thank you.
Excellent. All right, so let me take this moment to wrap up. Thank you so much, Olivier, for presenting your very thought-provoking and depressing paper for all of us today. Lots to think about for sure. Just letting everyone know that our next webinar will take place on June 18th with Zacharias Sautner from the University of Zurich, who's going to talk about his research, Do Investors Care About Biodiversity? And Eva has put a link in the chat for any of you that are interested in future webinars or past webinars. You should check out the e-Axes forum website. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. Okay, thanks a lot, everybody. That was great. And Alisa, I'd love to talk offline at any point.
Yeah, me
of course.
too.
There's a lot to do. So we start with the data and some facts and opening up some big questions, but still a lot to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I can send you an email and I'll make sure to fully read your paper. But I think there's a lot of food for thought. And also I've thought about these issues a lot. So I'm sure we can have some sharp debate. And actually on that note, Parinta, I also have one more note on your paper, if you don't mind, which was by the way such an interesting presentation. So also a lot more to talk about. So I will finally send you an email. I was like too busy, but
no rush. We're lots to think about and nothing. Happy to chat further.
So just one note, and then we can also chat offline. But actually, for my climate finance course at Cornell, so like Perinta, Olivier, I'm teaching climate finance. I am working with my students on real world problems with real world partners. And actually, we're literally working with the United Nations, UNEP-FI people that are in charge of the net zero alliances. So anyway, and my students are looking at some of the aspects of the Net Zero Banking Alliance. So I actually already mentioned your paper to them as a very good paper that they should take a look at. But anyway, we can maybe chat more offline, but I think it would also be valuable to put it more in their radar because they weren't fully aware. And I think it's a very important and well-written paper. So
thank you for that. Yeah, and I mean, they may not like it, but happy to talk to them. I think it's an important alliance. So thanks, Alyssa.
Yeah, no worries. So maybe just real quick on Anastasia, if that's okay, and Eva's remarks, and Olivier, this is a bit of a committee, you can say, but if you know it, but basically what I just wanted to make sure is that we have a few of the speakers that we have lined up for the that at least among the committee member with Perry and also with Mike and so on, we discussed. So actually there are more people that we would like to invite. So I don't know if this is a good time to talk about it now, very briefly while we're all here.
Yeah, maybe
that's
Olivier.
fine.
Yeah, Olivier, why don't you sign off?
Yeah, I'll just thank you so much for everything. I'll sign off.
Thank you,
I have
Olivier, very
I have
much. Yeah, this was
thank you.
very interesting.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the opportunity. It was
Yeah,
great.
and
Lots of
looking
great
forward to
thoughts.
getting more.
Yes, and
Great
let's be in touch.
presentation.
Bye-bye.
Okay, so it's just us now.
Yes.
Perfect.
Great.
Okay, this was incredibly interesting. And just one thing, I had a meeting in London with another economist who basically thinks that the best way to deal with brown assets is to have private investors buy their brown part. There, so breaking them down and sell, the brown part to investors. And I told him to read Olivier's paper because we had already put it on the on the webinar list. So I hadn't read it, but it's interesting.
So
Okay.
actually, I'm happy also to share with you a new, actually it's a policy brief that I'm writing with Bruegel together with Patrick Bolton and Jeremy Zettelmeier. And I'm also actually working on that note. I'm working literally with my students, also with the Glasgow Alliance for Net Zero. They're doing a project on coal phase out in Japan. And then I'm also working with my students, sorry for this, on a project related to the coal phase out in Indonesia related to this JETP deal. And what for example, GFENS and some other things that one thing you can do is you can get coal-fired power plants to close and sell carbon credits, but it's again not very clear on the aggregate level whether that actually leads to global emission reductions. And so what we and now we've done more work on this, but what we've shown in our work is that buying coal and as a state, but then for the purpose of closing it, is really a bargain. It's not expensive. And compared to the social benefits, right? And so essentially, like it seems like a lot of people get the dynamics wrong of what should happen. It's just literally like states should subsidize, provide grants for closure, and then provide incentives for the renewable replacement. And the social gain of that is enormous in terms of air pollution benefits, but also in terms of avoided climate damage. So we've done some more work, and I'm happy to share the paper to show the economic case of why, to me at least, the only real way in which you can get avoidance of emissions is by simply buying coal for closure. I mean, that's literally the only thing. And you cannot really expect investors to do that either. But anyway, this is a rant. I think we should...
It's a political issue. South Africa was giving massive subsidies to their coal industry. And then they stopped giving the subsidies and they bought the coal. So there was a political sort of tornado against them because they it's hard for people to understand how you say I'm stopping the subsidies, but I'm buying, the coal company. So they were, it was a mess because people were calling the government hypocrite, that they're not doing anything for climate. So there's also how you present this to the public. In a way, I mean, what you're saying could be actually their thinking. It was not perceived as such. So, but anyway, it's a very interesting. Please send your. I apologize for the horrible voice. Please send your paper. Send your paper, the one you were just saying about from Bruegel.
Yeah, absolutely. So
Can you
maybe
hear me?
in the interest of time, if we can
Yeah,
try
sorry,
to
I have to run in
efficient.
5 minutes.
Yes, no, exactly. Let's be efficient. So one thing, can we call the subcommittee
Yes.
the committee, because subcommittee sounds not very great. And
So
I think
PhD student committee.
I don't think you have to say student, just PhD committee. I think. Do you agree with that,
Okay.
Perry?
No, I think that because PhD committee implies they already have their PhDs.
I
So
see.
yeah, I
I would agree with that.
student is okay. I don't know. That's what they are. I don't
PhD
know.
PhD candidate committee.
Mhm.
Yeah, or PhD students. I think it's right. I'm happy with either.
But
So
I agree.
PhD students.
Yeah, PhD student committee, I think is
Yeah,
good.
great. Okay, and then real quick, so as you might remember, I don't know if I can pull up my email quickly, Perry, but
Mhm.
both Mike and I had some suggestions for the papers that we liked from the set of submissions.
Mhm.
Are you happy if we don't have to, I'm happy to pull up the email if I can find it, but are you happy if we just pick the
Yes.
concept?
Yes. I thought I had thought I had replied, but I'm totally good with moving forward with your picks. And I don't think we should wait around for the other committee
Oh,
ones.
absolutely. I fully agree. And then the final note. So that was, I think, also part of my pick. But one person that we can ask really quickly would be Julian Kubel. I don't know if you know him, Perry, but he wrote these papers on aggregate confusion, and he's
Yeah,
very.
I know. He's great. He's at Sloan, right? Doing a postdoc.
Yeah, and well, he's also, I think he's now an assistant professor at maybe the University of Zurich or something like that.
Okay,
He's
got
not
it. So,
related to Sloan. So he would be someone that I think would be good to ask for the next. So basically, you mentioned that the next webinar will be June 18th, right? But I think we can actually line up two more in between. And Julian would be the one that can hopefully do it in 2 weeks.
okay, works for
Okay.
me.
Alyssa, can you send me his
Yes.
contact details and the name of his paper, and I can get in touch with him?
Yeah, absolutely. That sounds great. And then I'll also forward you the list of papers that we selected from the submission, and so you can schedule them for the other dates that are coming up.
Yeah. Mhm.
Great. All right. Well, that's all, I guess. I
Yeah.
hope it's in time for you, Perry.
No problem. Thanks, Alyssa. Thanks, Anastasia. Thanks, Eva.
Great.
Oh,
Anastasia, we can't hear you.
or maybe
Yes.
medium. Yeah.
No.
No.
Can you type?
Now.
Now it's better. Go closer to the. Can you go closer to the screen? Yeah, okay, yes. Who will be moderating each of the papers? So who will moderate the Julian Kubel paper?
So I think we should ask ideally the other committee members to do it, just because I think it's important also for representation that there's that is not just a subset of us doing it. So Perry, you're the collaborator of Ishita, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Do you think you're able to ask Ishita if she can do the one of Julian Kubel?
Okay, I can ask her. Yeah.
Okay, great. Sure. And if not, I mean, we can probably also ask Diego.
We'll just tell her to do it.
Yeah. Great. I like that.
Yeah.
All right.
Well, as long as the dates, as the dates work out, obviously.
Yeah, exactly.
Well,
Free, I'm sure she'll do it. Yeah. Mhm.
So we could do one towards the end of May and one at the beginning of June, because after the 18th of June, we need to stop because of the summer and people don't attend usually the webinars.
Mhm.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So we do two, right? One in the middle of April and sorry, one in the middle of May and one at the beginning of April, right? That's the two that
Yes,
we'll schedule. Sure, that sounds great.
good.
Yeah, I think what I would do, has Diego moderated one?
So yeah,
No.
he also needs to do one. So I think it should
I
be
would just schedule the two and ask Diego and Ishita which of the two they're available for, and I'm
Yeah.
sure one of them will probably be available for one or the other.
And the other paper? I
So-
think what you said, Alisa, it's good to start using some of the papers that people are submitting, because otherwise it's not a credible sort of suggestion to
Yes,
them.
absolutely. So that's exactly what we're doing, right? So we picked a few from the ones that we like.
Ah, okay.
So we do the other one that's from the two that will be presented in mid-May and beginning of June. One of them will be a submitted paper.
Perfect. Do you need, Eva said that she received some more papers. Do you need her to send you all of the papers we have so far, or the newest ones?
I would say that we would first just stick to the ones we've already evaluated, and then we
Okay.
can evaluate the next submissions for the batch of presentations coming up after fall. And by the way, as we discussed, it would be good if we can try to line up the entire webinar schedule at the beginning of
Exactly.
fall, so that we don't have to do that last minute like we do now.
Which we cannot do that. I mean, this is
No, we
also
have to do
why we cannot do the recurring Zoom, because I called Zoom, and if we start canceling, you know, scheduled recurring webinars, it can make a big mess.
Yes.
So if we have the entire schedule, then we can schedule everything on a recurring basis.
Yeah, that's exactly what we need.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah, and so one more thing, by the way, Eva and Anastasia. So I also promised to reach out to a few more PhD students from the top schools, if you like, because we haven't gotten a lot of suggestions from their supervisors. So that we in total have about 25 that are part of this group. Because I think now we have also really good students, but they're from the, doesn't matter, but lesser known schools. That doesn't,
Yes.
I think it's good to have a good representation across schools. So maybe one question to you, Perry, before you drop. Is there any PhD student at Columbia that is doing climate finance that you would recommend?
So there are a lot, like in fact, Olivier's co-author is a PhD student, Yuki Zhang. But I don't know, I don't want to sign anyone up, so I can just send an email. Do we have an email that I can send around to the PhD?
Yes,
Okay.
yes, absolutely.
Yeah, I can just send it around for anyone that's.
Great.
Mhm.
So,
So Alyssa,
Alisa,
are you
are
going
you
to send
going
that
to send?
to Perry?
Sorry?
Alyssa, are you going to send that email to Perry?
Yes, exactly. And I will also then reach out to the other schools that I would like to get some representation from. So that's on my to-do list.
Yeah.
I asked Stefano Giglio and didn't hear anything from him. So maybe we could remind him. One thing, on May 1st, we are announcing the 2024 Research Prize. So I'll send you a message with a call for papers, or actually Eva could send you a message with a call for papers. So if you could, you know, forward it to anyone you think might be.
Well, you should get the email anyway that's going to go out on the 1st that you could also forward and share on social media. Okay.
Sorry, I have to run. I have another seminar. I
Okay.
will
Okay.
look at your email.
Bye. Thank you very much,
Nice to
Barry.
meet you, Perry, and I'll be in touch with you.
Thanks, Perry.
Okay.
Okay.
Great. So that's it, I guess, right? Or is there any
I
other?
thought it was a very nice conversation today.
Yeah, I agree. I think it was very engaged.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think honestly, if we keep pushing, especially if we can get the recurring meeting set up, I hope we can actually edge at some point above 100 people that attend. I think, you know, we're already at 50 or so, or close to 50. I think
It was higher than 50. It was 63 at some point. I mean, we had more than 100 people register,
yeah,
but not everybody that registers attends. And I do get messages sometimes in advance saying I've registered, but I can no longer attend. Will it be available to view afterwards?
exactly. So I think
Great.
we're doing well. And I think as an internal target, we should have that. We should get 100 participants each time when we have I think we can get there. So yeah.
The other thing that I wrote on my email is that we discussed during the board meeting to launch a working paper series, much like the CPR and the NBR. So we're going to put an editorial. They're not going to be refereeing. It's not going to be a journal, but it will we'll sort the different submissions, and then maybe twice a year we will publish an ebook with the papers that they think are the most interesting one or the more cutting edge research. So that's another way, to further.
Yeah, that's a nice idea, actually. That's also, especially if paper submissions are, I think if you can combine paper submissions that we thought were valuable, even if they were not all presented, I think that's
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. And that's also a further motivation to submit because your paper might be featured, right?
Might be featured, exactly. So this is what triggered the idea, is that we have quite a few papers sorry, being submitted. So we might as well do something.
Yes.
With, not that they're all great. I mean, there's some a bit crappy, but
yeah. No, that's a great idea. Actually, I like it. I think if you ask people, would they rather submit their new paper to MBR as a working paper or CPR, they would do, I think, CPR or MBR, right? But so I don't think we can compete, but I do think we can say that we would that if they submit their paper to e-access, they both have an opportunity to present, and for their paper to be highlighted in a bundle that discusses even if they don't present in the end, because there may be too many submissions, in a sort of ebook that is, I don't know, published every quarter or so, or every, I guess, semester, so maybe twice a year, that is trying to summarize some of these papers and how they contribute to the debate, right? Or something like that. It would be
exactly.
nice.
This is the whole thing. But Alisa, what is the new research program that CPR launched with Patrick Bolt?
Yeah, I'm actually a committee member of that.
What is it? Tell me.
It's called the new program of the environment and climate. So it's literally, I guess, MBR MBR has environmental economics, but CPR didn't have a research area dedicated to climate yet. So it's their new environment research program. Actually, Diego, I saw, is also a member of it, and so am I. And then, mixture of professors and associate and assistant professors, I guess. So.
Okay, so it's you will be publishing, research through this program, or it's grants that sort of incentivizes research?
I mean, it's literally the same as the other existing research areas of CPR. So you can publish your working papers as a CPR working paper. You can publish Vox talks. You can, there's opportunities to organize conferences and do talks. So it's really a kind of network, right?
Everything.
To disseminate your research ideas and have both a research and a policy impact. So that's, I guess, the goal. Yeah.
Okay. Great.
Well, both, and let me try to do it right away, because I always know if I don't do it right away, I will get too busy and I won't do it at all. So
Yeah, fantastic. So I can reach out to Julian as soon as possible.
yeah, I will put you now in touch, and then let me send the email with the introduction, and then you can try to schedule it and try to get him to accept in 2 weeks. It would be great. I'm happy for him to present any paper. It might be helpful if you follow up with him to say what other papers were presented, just so that he's incentivized to pick a really good paper, because I think we have had a very high standard of very high quality presentations of very high quality work. So you might want to send him, for example, Olivier Darmouni, the one that just presented now, what he presented, just so that he gets a sense of sort of, the quality that is being expected. Right? And what Pari presented before. But he can pick whatever he wants, I think, because he has a good set of papers out there. But I think we should encourage him to present a paper that has some broad appeal, right? So I don't know which set of papers he exactly published, but some might be more narrow and some might be broader. So I think the
Well,
more,
what did you say? You had mentioned something before, aggregate confusion.
yeah, but that's a paper that is so famous that, you know, it got like, it was all over the news for years, and it's got, I don't know, it has like 2,000 citations now. So that paper is kind of, it's old news, right? So it doesn't
Okay,
make
okay.
sense to present that. I mean, he could, but I mean, he could do it as a subsection of new work as well, but not just, he cannot just present that.
Okay, great.
All right, thank
So
you so much.
we'll wait to hear from you.
And I hope you get better, Anastasia.
Me too. Thank you. Okay, bye-bye.
Okay, thanks, Alyssa.
Good.
You don't sound better.
No, I don't. And the doctor is pissing me off.
Did you take a COVID test?
No, it's not COVID. She wants me to take all these stupid powders and things like that when I know I need antibiotics. So I have antibiotics, but I don't have for the entire course.
I
mean, I
know.
feel
Look,
exhausted. I
I'm
can't work.
used to the UK where you could die before they give you antibiotics.
I think it's the same thing here. The point
No,
is, I feel
it used to be in Italy that they would give you, if you sneezed, they would give you antibiotics.
oh really?
But now maybe they're changing their ways because of the resistance that's growing to antibiotics. But anyway, what does she
Anyway,
want
I'm
you to take?
exhausted.
There's something called what is it called? Oh my God. I use it all the time. I'm having a complete blank. If I remember the name, I'll send it to you.
Anyway, I think I'm gonna go to bed now. I feel exhausted. I came down here, but I made a mistake. I should have stayed up.
Do you have a fever?
No, I mean, it's
Okay.
36.9, 37, 37.1. It's not, it's the coughing that completely exhausts me.
Vicks Vapor Rub. I'm a big fan. It's my Windex.
We all have one. Okay, good. So this is good. I mean, I'm happy, there is a progress on this because
But just so that you know, I did a little count. All of the PhD candidates were on. Okay. So that's great. And I'm glad to see that Alyssa showed up as well. That was good.
yeah. And also, Eva, did you ask Barry for the PB?
Yes, she said she was going to provide it today.
Perfect. Excellent. I can go sleep now.
Yeah, but that doesn't mean I have it
The
yet.
video, I know. I'll send you the video.
The video you can do tomorrow morning, okay? Because, I'm still in London and I'm really sorry, but I'm going out tonight.
Have fun.
Thank you. Feel better.
Thank you.
Okay.
Talk to you
All right.
soon. Thanks.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.